How's it going, everybody? It's SaltyTreecko. Alright, let's cut the shit, alright? You listen to me. This video is meant more as a companion video to a video I made a little bit ago where I tried to objectively rank the Pokemon types. So, before you watch this video, or even if you just... listen up. Click, you see the funny card in the top corner, and if it went away now, hit the little I button. Go watch that video first. This is meant more of a companion video to that video, so it's not going to make as much sense unless you watch that video. Okay, here's the thing. If you're not going to watch both videos, I don't care. Go watch that video and don't watch this video if you're only going to watch one of them. That one's going to be the cool, sort of heavily edited, more so that video. That one's better. Go watch that one now, and then you can watch this one after if you want to watch this one too. Anyway, this one is more my opinionated, less objective, just more of a discussion. This video is going to be less edited. It's going to be more like a podcast than anything. So if you wanna, you're farming Ranbat, Elo, or whatever on Showdown, you just want to throw this video on in the background, I'm chill with that. Whoops, I forgot. Spoiler alert. Whoops, sorry, get out of there, normal type. Anyway, let's get to the first let's get to the first type, which is the normal type. So in my objective tier list, I had normal ranked big ol' number 18 as the worst type in the game. Yeah, my view has not changed. In my opinion, normal type is still the worst type in the game. I mean, it shouldn't be too much of a shock, right? So I'm going to be ranking these from a subjective standpoint as well. Like, not only my opinion, but I'm going to be ranking them not in context, which that was a major part of my other video, where I was ranking them in context. So I was taking, like, the Pokemon, number of Pokemon, base stat total into account. This video, I'm not going to be doing that, so it's going to be purely in a vacuum. And I don't think that matters for normal type. I still think normal type is by far the worst type in the game, and I don't think it's close. It doesn't do anything defensively. Like, it has a nice immunity to Ghost, which can be useful because Ghost is a type that really is difficult to switch in, so normal is like the only type that can really do that effectively. However, it also, like, can't hit it back, and it has no other defensive utility. Being weak to fighting is bad. On the offensive side, it completely sucks. See, the thing with normal is that it's fundamentally flawed, because it's like supposed to be this blank slate type where nothing can really do much to it, but it doesn't really do much back. But it does that poorly, because then, like, you have the part where you're not super effective against anything, but then you still are resisted by steel and rock. So I don't really get where the developers were going with normal type. It feels like it was intended initially to be a blank slate type, which was like what it was in Generation 1, but then they just kind of decided not to do that anymore. So they just made it objectively bad in every scenario. It's like, imagine the dragon type, but if it did absolutely fucking nothing, and now you have the normal type. And I don't feel like I need to say too much else about the normal type. It shouldn't be a shock to anybody. It was initially the most overtuned type in the game, and now it's by far the most undertuned type in the game. Let's stop talking about a type that everyone knows is bad. Let's move on to... Actually, you know what? I'm gonna do this in order, which, now that I'm tabbing over to the recording, you can't actually see the order, so it's gonna be arbitrary, but it's the order that they're listed in the tier list, so that way I'm not doing any spoilers. So we'll do them in order. We'll start with Fire. So Fire, let me check my notes. I have it in the B tier. So Fire type is ranked about the same in both lists. My opinion on the Fire type is that it's a type that started out pretty weak, but over time has gradually gotten better. The introduction of heavy-duty boots was obviously just fantastic for the Fire type, just amazing. It was the type that really struggled defensively, both on its, just with the type chart, and also the fact it was weak to rocks. So now that it doesn't really have that effective rock weakness anymore, at least to stealth rocks, because of boots, it brought out a lot more defensive utility in the Fire types. You see Fire types like, what's the guy's name? The fucking Entei looking guy. Like, Gouging Fire, is that the name of him? Raging Fire? I don't even know, man. You see guys like... you see guys like him, man, the Paradox names, they just mix me up. But you see guys like him using, like, a more combined offensive-defensive set. Like, you see, like, the Dragon Dance, like, Breaking Swipe will, like, sets do good because you can actually leverage Fire's defensive utility now that they have boots. And then defensive fire types have Will-Wisp now, and they have like Morning Sun, so they have actual defensive utility now, in addition to their offensive utility, which was already good, and which is even better in Generation 9, now that the fire type has access to Sun being not only by far the best weather, but actually one of the better play styles in the game. So fire type gets a huge boost from that. And then it's just always been a pretty solid offensive typing as well. With a lot of decent targets, namely Steel type. It's one of the few types that can actually damage the Steel type. So, overall, Fire, honestly, it was a type that, before doing like the tier lists and thinking about it in like a new way, I thought pretty poorly about the Fire type, but now, honestly, I'm pretty high on the Fire type. I think it's a pretty solid type. So, moving on to the Water type. This was a type that everyone was really tilted about when I had it ranked like towards the middle in my objective list, and yeah, I'm kind of with you. I think that within that list, it being a sort of mid-tier type made sense, but I think if you want to think about it from a more in a vacuum standpoint, then Water type definitely deserved better, and if that was one of your things that you didn't like about my previous list, there you go. In a vacuum, and from a subjective standpoint, Water is obviously a tremendous type. Water is a type that can really do it all. It's good defensively, it's good offensively, it has good moves, both offensively and for support moves. Has great Pokemon of the type. And it's like, Water is a better blank slate type than normal, both in practicality and in fundamentality, because offensively it's like, its type chart like isn't tremendous, and defensively its type chart isn't tremendous, but it's able to work because if you have the stats and literally can do anything offensively to be able to wield the type successfully, you're going to be able to do that. And we see a lot of successful Water types being able to leverage its bulk to and relatively blank slate type chart. If I remember correctly, it's only weak to Electric and Grass. Has a decent amount of resistances, but usually you just want it to not be hit super effectively. Moves like Scald are great even if they have lower distribution now. Flip Turn's a great offensive move, and then obviously you have Rain, which in the past, not so much in Generation 9, has been one of the better, if not the best weather, which now it's been dethroned by Sun because Sun is absolutely on crack, but being able to power up your offensive moves. Weakening fire moves is like, whatever. Fire definitely got the better end of the deal there with actually weakening a move or a type it's like, weak to, rather than now fire types just don't do absolutely jack to you, which like, okay, cool. Overall, great type though. I don't think too much more needs to be said about Water. It's just a type that can really excel no matter what you're doing with it. Great offensively, you see Pokemon like Greninja and like Barraskewda, and how Floatzel do well with it, and on the defensive end, you have, the bulky Waters are just like a staple Pokemon, like, archetype in general, and I don't need to even bother listing all the Pokemon that have succeeded defensively with Water. So let's move on to the Grass typing. So Grass is going to continue its D-tier trend. Fortunately for Grass, it at least has the nice little color matchup here with the D tier. If you average out the two colors in this little thing, I think it would average about to that. So that's a nice little aesthetic thing. What am I talking about? Yeah, Grass is not a good type. Unfortunately, despite being my mascot's type, I have to put it in D tier because it kind of fucking sucks. Grass is just terrible offensively. Like, in a purely hypothetical sense, it seems like it would be good offensively because you're able to hit ground types and water types super effectively, and that is two pretty great traits to have. But then you realize it has so many goddamn resistances. Like, you got the fire type, you got poison type, you got flying type, you got bug type, you got dragon type, you got steel type. That's just so many types to be able to resist that basically no matter what battle you're pulling up to, your opponent is always going to have at least one, realistically two, and potentially even 3 or 4 resists to grass type just casually on their team. So even though it has potential offensively, that potential is just kind of wasted because of how just many resists it has. The place that grass type really excels at, or not excels, the reason grass type is not an F tier correction is because it actually has some pretty decent defensive traits. The reasoning by its offense isn't great is kind of the reason why its defense is pretty good, because even though it's weak to a lot of types, like fire, ice, flying, bug, maybe some others, I don't know, that's just off the top of my head, poison, even though you have a lot of weaknesses, the resists that you do have are pretty good. Like, electric is a nice resist to have, and ground is a nice resist to have, and water. Those are, even though you have a lot of weaknesses, those 3 resist means you have pretty good defensive utility, against a lot of common types and a lot of strong types that not a lot of different types can switch into. And you see Pokemon like Ferrothorn and like Tangrowth be able to leverage their grass type to good success, obviously with the help of other things like, the steel type for Ferrothorn and Regenerator for Tangrowth. But that's also in part due to the success, or their success is also mostly due to the grass type as well, and the tools that it provides them. So now we're going to be moving on to the electric type, which I think is going to be one of the bigger jumps from where it was on the tier list last time, and I'm going to be putting it in C tier. My reasoning, well, I think a lot of people would still put electric type in a tier higher than I did, and I fundamentally disagree with it. I think if you were ranking the types purely off of just their potential to be good, like, if you're ranking them off of their maximum potential, I think electric type could even potentially be like an A tier type. But I think the problem with the electric type is similar to the reason why it was ranked so poorly. I think it was like second to last. Yeah, it was second to last in the other ranking. Is because it does one thing really well, but it does everything else really shit. So, you see Pokemon like Zapdos, who are paired with like the flying type to get compensation for absolutely being blanked by ground type, be really good because of that secondary typing. And then you see Pokemon, I'll put it this way, pure electric typing is one of the single worst defensive types in the game, which feels strange because it's only weak to ground, and then it has a decent amount of resists, but being weak to ground is really shitty, and the resistances it has aren't really too important. So you really need a good secondary typing to pair with it, and you see Pokemon with good secondary typings paired with it do pretty well. Like you see, like I mentioned, Zapdos, and you see Pokemon like previous generations like Magnezone. But the thing is, part steel typing can make any type look like look like a god tier, except for rock, and except for normal. 2 exceptions, and except for ice. Okay, 3 exceptions, but that's still pretty good. Point being, electric type is really shitty defensively, and it's really shitty for offensive physical types. The only like category of Pokemon it pairs really well with are fast offensive special types. And if you were a fast offensive special attacker, like, yeah, you can use the type really well. And once again, you see Pokemon like Zapdos, and you see Pokemon like Rotom Wash and Rotom Heat in Generation 8 perform very well because of it. But if you're not one of those archetypes, if you're not in that archetype of Pokemon, you're really missing out with the electric type, and it's a type that's really hard to take advantage of otherwise. The next one we're going to be talking about is conveniently very similar to the electric type, which is going to be the big ol' ice type. Now, the ice type is another type which does something very well and everything else very poorly, hence why I am ranking them very closely on the tier list. And yeah, that's actually how those two are going to stay. There's going to be nothing in between them. So the ice type is one of, if not the I need to stray away from that word. It's one of, if not the best types in the game offensively. If this was an offensive type tier list, that would probably be there. Unfortunately, it's not. And if this was a defensive type tier list, ice would be here. So, yeah, I'd say it kind of averages out to C. The thing with ice type is it's completely almost useless defensively. It is worse than normal defensively. It only resists itself, which, I mean, ice is good offensively, so that's something, I guess. Although it has more weaknesses than normal. So it's worse defensively, but then on the offensive side, it's just kind of cracked. Great moves all around. If you're running Hail, you get 100% accurate blizzards. Ice Beam is a great move. And then Water would usually be a problem, but then you pull out Freeze Dry and it's over for the ice or for the Water type. So just oh yeah, and I forgot it sports the most scary status in the game with Freeze. I am begging for the day that Game Freak decides to change Freeze to like Frostbite or something. It's like the special version of Burn. See, that would make so much sense, wouldn't it? But no. Instead, just you get frozen. Fuck you. Take the L. you lost your Pokemon because of 10% chance. It's a little less serious than that nowadays after the stupid freeze changes. But I mean, let's think about it. In this day and age, Gen 9 is very offensively focused. So if you get frozen, like usually you're not like living more than like one or two extra hits anyway. So if you get frozen, you're pretty much dead. Just so bad defensively. Even the thing is that's different than electric or than fire is usually you're also using fire's defensive capabilities in addition to its offensive capabilities. So boots is nice to have on it. But with ice, you want to use its offensive capabilities so badly that you don't want to run boots. Like you want to run an offensive item. So you're even worse off defensively because you don't want to usually run boots. So guess what? You're eating those stealth rocks and you're taking 25%. And then it's decreasing your already shitty survivability even more. So ice type, terrible defensively, really great offensively. Overall, putting in C tier below electric. Next up, we have the fighting type, which is going to be joining the water type in A tier. Now, fighting type is a type that I can really see people... It's kind of a love-or-hate type. Like, fighting is, like, I could, like, see and justify arguments for, like, even C tier. But I personally think it's A tier. If you think this is a little high, even for, like, being high on it, don't worry, there'll eventually be more in between. It's going to be at the bottom of A tier. But the reason I like fighting type is because... Okay, so you could draw comparisons between fighting and electric types. Because fighting is a type that doesn't really do well defensively, and it doesn't really do well on the special offensive side. And electric is a type that doesn't do well defensively, and it doesn't do particularly well on the physical offensive side. The difference is that there are a bunch of physical electric types, and there are practically a zero quantity of fighting specials, or special fighting types. And even the ones that do have it usually have a other move to compensate for Focus Blast being a terrible move, like Lucario has Aura Sphere, and even then, just use the physical set on it, which is better. So, fighting type is great because it absolutely just blasts the crap out of everybody. Like, big, strong, fighting, close combat, big, good damage. Like, close combat, now with its increased distribution, is just such an amazing stab move to have for literally any type. It's great as stab, it's good as coverage. Unfortunately, there's no good fighting type coverage move because, focus miss. But there's really not many situations where I would be like, oh no, I'm a fighting type Pokemon, this is bad, unless you have like 10 trillion special attack and your only fighting type move that you know is Focus Blast. And the type itself is still pretty good, which is another reason I'd put it over electric, is that it has better defensive utility than electric. And I think its offensive capabilities are, honestly, probably a little bit better than electric too. So I think overall it rounds out to be a little bit better of a type. It's definitely a very one-size-fits-all, one-trick pony type. It's definitely not a bad trick to have. So fighting type is going to be getting A tier for me, but I can definitely see arguments for a lower. And we are going to be moving right away to the poison type, which is going to be getting the C tier. This is about the same, once again, to where it was in the other tier list. The thing with poison is that it's just like... it's such a weird type because it's so fucking mid. Like, there's... Poison type is the exact opposite of the other two types in the tier, where electric and Ice are there because they do one thing well and other things very poorly. Poison's a type that really doesn't do anything well, and it really doesn't do anything poorly. Like, it has some decent resist, but it also has some bad weaknesses. So, like, resisting fighting is useful, and resisting fairy is useful, but then being weak to ground is not good, and to a lesser extent, being weak to psychic isn't good. And then offensively, like, being able to hit fairy super effectively is pretty good, but then also offensively, not being able to hit steel types whatsoever is pretty terrible. Not being able to hit ground types is pretty bad. I think Poison is kind of a candidate where I can see putting it in D tier as well. The reason I haven't in C is just because you have like some pretty good moves, like you have 100% accurate Toxic, which is nice, and you also have access to Toxic Spikes, and you also are capable of absorbing Toxic Spikes. And I think that's what's bumping it out of D and into C for me. Once again, other spoiler, this is going to be the bottom of C tier. There is one more type in there, which we'll get to in a second, but first we have to talk about, actually, you know what? Now, let's get this out of the way. Flying type is the other one in C tier. Flying type is a bit of a strange type. It's another it's like a less extreme case of these two, where it does one thing good and the other thing not too well, because offensive flying types definitely had their day, like in Gen 6 when you had Bird Spam, when you had like Talonflame and Mega Pinsir and guys like that, just being thrown onto one team. But those days have definitely passed, and flying type is definitely not the offensive type that it once was. First off, being weak to rocks, obviously bad. Second off, if you're going to be an offensive Pokemon, and you want to use the flying type, you want to use an item that isn't boots, so your options are either weaken yourself offensively or have a pretty crippling Stealth Rock weakness. Two, if you're going to be a physical offensive type, your best option is Brave Bird, which, with the recoil in conjunction to the Stealth Rock weakness, means you are incredibly frail and you have terrible sustainability. And if you're a special flying type, haha, you have to use Hurricane. Lamau, Hurricane sucks. So, that's honestly, like, the one reason Tornadus Therian wasn't banned in a lot of generations is because Hurricane is such a bad move. Like, and if you're not using Hurricane, like, what, you're using Air Slash? Like, Air Slash little, like, Air Slash as a competitive move is, like, how I would expect Air Slash to be in real life. It's like if I fucking, like, blew on you real good. It's like, okay, cool, like, a light breeze. And then you have the flinch chance, I guess, but, like, you really want more damage. So offensive flying types are kind of struggling. They still have a place, but they're not as commonplace, and they definitely have a lot more weaknesses than other types. And defensively, flying types are actually pretty good, especially now that they have boots, and especially now that defog is widespread, and especially considering that they have Roost. And a lot of flying types have been very meta in OU since Generation 6 with defog, and especially since Generation 8 with heavy-duty boots, because while offensive Pokemon really don't want to be using heavy-duty boots, defensive Pokemon don't mind having heavy-duty boots. Giving up leftovers isn't great, but being immune to Stealth Rocks is just so much better. So it's kind of a win-win. Like, Pokemon like Mandibuzz absolutely shot into the stratosphere when boots came out. Pokemon like Corviknight have been great. Pokemon like Skarmory have actually risen up. And it's just been overall pretty good for the... Oh, Pokemon like Zapdos. How could I forget Zapdos? Overall, Flying type is just a little less extreme than the other two, where good defensively could definitely be better offensively. And now we are going to talk about the Ground type, which is going to be going in, let me check my notes, the middle of A tier. So, this is kind of a weird type, because Ground is obviously pretty great offensively. That's like its one calling card is Earthquake. Earthquake is a move that is just such a great coverage move, because it's a great stab and coverage move, because it hits so many types super effectively. It's tied for fighting with the most types hit super effectively at 5. And the types that you do hit super effectively are actually pretty good too, so it's not like, it's not wasted upon it. Like, it's not quantity over quality. Like, they're pretty good quality, quality types to hit super effectively as well. And defensively, it's actually pretty good. We've seen Pokemon like Hippowdon, and Landorus wield the type very well. Resisting Stealth Rocks is great for a defensive Pokemon. You have good access to Stealth Rocks. which is funny because we're going to be talking about rock type in a little bit. And the ground types getting stealth rocks is kind of a reason for rocks placement, but no spoilers. No spoilers. No spoilers. Having pretty consistent access to spikes is also very good for the ground type. So overall, it's good offensively because it has good moves. It's overall a good type chart to have. I say its one weakness is that there are some types that would rather not be weak to, notably water and ice, but I'd say that those are like the only two major weaknesses of ground type. Like, not being able to hit flying types kind of sucks, but you typically have a rock move to pair it with, so that's not a huge issue, I would say. And you have some decent defensive traits, and you're good offensively, and you have a lot of good support moves, so I think the ground type deserves a nice little A tier. And you know what, as long as we're talking about the rock type, let's talk about, other way around, as long as we're talking about the ground type, let's talk about the rock type, which is going in F. Yep, I said it. Rock type fucking sucks. In fact, let me just rename the F tier to fucking sucks. S. I'm gonna get demonetized. Okay. So the reason rock type is so much lower than ground type is, I think I used this same analogy in the other video, but for a type that's supposed to be like rock solid, it is one of the worst defensive types in the game, which is really ironic. Just such a terrible type chart. It's pretty similar to ground defensively, except it doesn't have a lot of the good traits. Like, you're weak to basically the same types, but then you're also weak to steel, and you're also weak to ground, and you also don't have an electric immunity. So it's like, just pretty much objectively worse than ground defensively. I would rather have a ground type than a rock type, unless for some godforsaken reason I'm trying to resist normal, which, like, I don't know, man, maybe you need a fire resist, whatever. But I feel like the rock type is just kind of a hindrance to most types that it has. And then on the offensive side of the spectrum, it's also really bad because it has no good moves. Rock Slide is pretty inconsistent and it's pretty weak. Stone Edge is extremely inconsistent, and honestly, the power isn't really compensating for it much. Like, you see a lot of moves just have the same accuracy and a lot higher base power than Stone Edge does, which is kind of embarrassing. And you see Pokemon like Iron Boulder, like, actually do pretty well just because it doesn't have to run Stone Edge. It's just such a, purely inconsistent move, it sucks. And then on the special side, even though you don't see too many special rock types, it also kind of sucks, because, don't get me wrong, Meteor Beam is a good move, but it's not a move you really want to have as a primary stab, because it's a 2-turn charge move, so you need Power Herb, so it's more of a one-use move, and while that would be a good stab move to have, your other option for stab is, Power Gem, which is like 80 base power, so not too good. And the one thing rock type does have is access to stealth rocks, but you have, ground types, which are just like objectively better types to have on your team, both offensively and defensively, which could also set up stealth rocks and maybe even spikes. And then you have steel types, which can also set it up. So yeah, rock is really just kind of sad. The only reason it's not below normal is because at least it can do something offensively, even if that something is pretty inconsistent and not too great. So we will be moving on to a type which I think was extremely overtuned, or extremely overrated in my objective video, which is the psychic type, which is going to be put nice in the bottom of D tier, or the top of D tier rather. The only reason it's over grass is because you have even though it's really niche and really inconsistent, you do have psychic terrain teams, which can be really threatening if you're not prepared for them, but they are a gimmick, and they're not a great gimmick, so it doesn't lift psychic out of D tier. Apologies for that. The thing with psychic type is that, listen man, it's not Generation 1 anymore. We have dark types, and we have steel types, and we have bug types and ghost types that have actual moves. The thing that made psychic type so extremely overpowered and overtuned in Gen 1 is, one, Dark and Seal didn't exist, so that's one type that is immune and hits it super effective not there, and a type that's resistant not there. But the thing is, bug type moves just kind of didn't exist, and ghost type moves just kind of didn't exist, and for that matter, Ghost-type moves existed so little that they actually made Psychic-type... Is it immune? I'm not sure if it's immune or resistant, but they accidentally made Psychic, like, either immune or resistant to Ghost, because there are so few Ghost moves that they just fucking forgot. Which is kind of sad. So, now you have a type that's immune and hits it super effectively, which is also a pretty good type. One of the best types in the game, which it can't hit. A type which previously you just couldn't hit it because of moves and base stat total, now has base stat total and moves to hit it. And then another type which is now extremely meta relevant, which has moves to hit it again. So it's pretty bad defensively and pretty bad offensively. I'd say the only gimmick it really has is Psychic Terrain, which, once again, it's a gimmick. It's nothing more than that. It's like Trick Room. So, moving on from Psychic type, we have our other and final D-tier resident, and in fact, this is actually going to be... Yeah, this is the final poorly rated type. Now, every other type is going to be at least a B-tier. So that's pretty cool. So, Bug type's going in D-tier, which might seem kind of strange, because Bug type has a reputation for being pretty terrible. But here's the thing, man. It's not Generation 1 anymore. There aren't just freaking Beedrill as Bug types. Like, you have some ungodly good moves in the Bug type. Like, you have Sticky Web, which, like, is an entire, like, playstyle defining move. You have Quiver Dance, which is the single best boosting move in the game, which isn't attached to some, like, crazy, stupid legendary or pseudo-legendary. You have U-Turn, which is a great pivot move, and you even see non-Bug types using U-Turn. And you have Pokemon like Volcarona, who have, like, you know, actual stats. So, the Bug type ain't the Bug type it used to be. However, what the Bug type is now still isn't actually great, so it's getting thrown into the D tier. Bug type's main issue is actually on offense, because defensively it's not too terrible of a type. Once again, it's weak to rocks, which is not good, obviously, especially for offensive Pokemon, but I feel like a lot of offensive Bug types don't usually mind having boots as much as other types like flying, or, yeah, not so much fire. Maybe they mind a little more than fire. But offensively is just, like, it's terrible. Like, you hit Psychic, you hit Bug, and you hit Dark, and, like, that's it. Or not Bug, you hit Psychic, Grass, and Dark. Which, you know, that's not a really great list of types to hit super effectively. And then if you think about the types that resist it, you have Poison, Flying, Fire, Fighting, Steel, and Fairy. I might be forgetting one, which is a lot of types that resist it, and a lot of very good types that resist it. So it's a pretty poor offensive type, and even offensive Bug types that you see, like Volcarona, usually don't even use a Bug move. They usually just use, like, their secondary stab and a coverage move. So, just terrible offensively, but it actually is pretty decent defensively. As I mentioned, rocks suck, but being weak to rock isn't terrible. And then you have the actual... I don't think any other type in the game resists both fighting and ground. So you have that going for you. So overall, it's definitely a better type than people give it credit for. It's definitely a bad offensive type. Like, there's no way to get around it. It's ranked so low just because it's so bad offensively. But it makes up for that to get out of F tier with the fact that it's actually pretty underrated defensively, and the fact that it has some of the most cracked moves in the game. So moving on to, this actually might be the last A tier, which it is, and it will be going in, if I can move it, the top of A tier is going to be the Ghost type. So the Ghost type is a case where it's a little closer to fighting, where it only does like one thing really good, but the reason it's above fighting is the one thing it does is so absolutely fucking good that it doesn't even matter. Which is Spam Shadow Ball. Congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, that is the Ghost type. Ghost type is Shadow Ball the move, which is not a, you know, it's an A tier for a reason. That's not a bad gimmick to have. Shadow Ball is a great move because, okay, look at the type tier list right now, and name me the types, here, I'll move this in a frame. Name me the types that resist Ghost. I found them. They're right here. It's just normal and just dark, which I will talk about dark in a second. And other than that, nothing else resists it. So normal types in competitive Pokemon basically don't exist. So the only, except for like Blissey or something. But other than that, you just have dark types that resist you. And dark types aren't a particularly amazing defensive type, so it's pretty easy to weaken them or take them out entirely, and then you just have just no switch-ins to Shadow Ball. It is by far, I would say, the easiest type to spam in the game offensively, maybe a little bit over fighting type. It's just because it's so goddamn good offensively, like nothing resists it. Like it doesn't hit much super effectively, like it's just, I think it's just itself and just psychic. But for an offensive type, that's pretty damn good. And on top of that, Ghost type is actually pretty good defensively as well. Think about what types hit Ghost super effectively. I'll give you a second. Wow, there they are! It's itself and Dark type. So once again, if you take the Dark type out of the equation, really nothing's hitting your Ghost type super effectively. So it's a type that, even though it's generally frail and doesn't have recovery, it's a type that's really hard to kill in one hit, and it's just so hard to switch into. It is by far the hardest type to switch into in the game, and Shadow Ball is one of the hardest moves to switch into in the game. It's a great type overall. Love Ghost type. Those are my boys. Love them. And as long as we're talking about the Dark type will be going in B tier. It'll be going there on B tier. Dark is a pretty good type. Offensively, it's one of the better types in the game. Has a pretty solid offensive spread, although it does have some pretty bad types that it hits not very effectively. Not hitting fairy types kind of sucks, and not hitting fighting types kind of sucks. But other than that, you're pretty good. Knockoff is one of, if not the best physical moves in the entire game. So spammable, good base power, amazing utility with removing items. It's just a great move. And it has pretty good distribution. A lot of dark types get it, a lot of non-dark types get it. You have Nasty Plot, which is a great dark type move for boosting your special attack. You're immune to Prankster, which is pretty good defensive utility. Overall, it's a pretty solid offensive type, and its one Achilles heel is its defensive capabilities, because it resists itself, which is nice, it resists Ghost, which is freaking really good, and you're immune to Psychic, which is okay, but being weak to fighting is bad, being weak to Bug is bad, and I'll get to that in a second, and being weak to Fairy is bad, so you have some pretty bad, types to be weak to in there. And Bug, the reason Bug is such an issue is because usually for dark types, they're usually not too bulky, they're usually more frail offensive attackers. And the thing with bug types is a lot of non-bug types learn U-turn, and a lot of them have pretty solid base attack. So even if it's like a non-stab low base power move, if you're an offensive Pokemon and you're getting hit with like even a moderately powerful attack U-turn, like you're still gonna take like at least fucking half from that, which is really bad. So even though bug type isn't too good offensively, it's still not a type you want to be weak to, especially when you're a type that's most common like a frail attacker. So that's not great for the dark type, but overall I'd still put it in the B tier. And moving on, I'm not gonna lie, this wasn't like an audience retention thing. The two last types that I haven't talked about yet are the two S tiers. And let's get Dragon out of the way first. Dragon is definitely by far the single most overrated type in my other tier list, for obvious reasons. If you want to hear more about that, watch that video. I talk about that for a long time. You should have watched that video first anyway. But anyway, let's talk about the Dragon type. The Dragon type is it's an interesting type, because similarly to normal, it doesn't actually have much offensive utility. It does hit itself super effectively, but other than that, it's pretty similar to normal, in the fact that other than yourself, you don't hit anything super effectively, and then you have two types that resist, and one's actually immune, in Steel and Fairy. So it's not a great offensive type, but what it makes up for with lack of types that hit super effectively is general lack of resist. Like I mentioned, it's just those two, and really ridiculously high base power moves. Because you have like your Draco Meteors, which are 130, used to be 140, and you have like your Outrages, which are 120 and are really good. And it makes Dragon, if you don't have one of those two types, Dragon can kind of just wipe your team. But if you do have one or both of those types, which a lot of competitive Pokemon teams do, it's a little easier to manage. So it's it's a little limiting in team building, but not that limiting. You just have to be warned with dragon types because, let's put it this way, every single competitive Pokemon team should have at least one steel type on it, and I would say at least one fairy on it. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, maybe not fairy, but typically every competitive Pokemon team has a steel or a fairy on it, and that makes dragon type just not as good. And on the defensive end, dragon type is actually pretty solid. You have a lot of useful resistances, like water. You have the three primary types. You have water, fire, and grass, which you're resistant to. And resisting electric is a nice trait to have as well. And then it's only ice, dragon, and fairy that you're weak to, so not terrible. Could be worse. So it's a pretty decent defensive type. And it's a type that, if you can get your counters out of the way, it can be a very tricky type to switch into. So I would say that averages out at about a B tier. And moving on, we have our two best types in the game. Okay, I'm just going to move them up now. They are Steel and Fairy. These are our S tiers. And with that, that is the tier list complete. Make sure to like and subscribe. Okay, I'll actually talk about the types. The Fairy type is what I'm going to be putting as the second best type in the game. The only thing that I think Fairy doesn't have over Steel is... Let's see, how do I want to talk about this? Okay, I'll talk about it this way. Fairy type is kind of held back a little bit by its distribution. Like, a lot of Fairy types either don't have reliable recovery, or have a shitty secondary type, or just don't have very good offensive moves. But the thing with the Fairy type is that it's definitely one of the higher average types in the game. Like, Fairy is kind of a type you can just slap onto any type and just, like, be okay with it. Because you're immune to Dragon, which is really good. You resist Bug, which, I mean, okay, I guess, sure. But the thing is, the types that hit it super effectively just aren't very good offensive types. Like, you have Poison, which is, like, whatever, I guess, and then you have Steel, which isn't a very common offensive typing. So, you're just an overall very solid defensive typing. And then you resist Dark as well, which is nice. And you resist Fighting. So, the thing with Fairy is, at the moment, Fairy was introduced to specifically nerf good types and make bad types better offensively, which, the thing is, that made it so much better, because Fighting types, Dark types, and Dragon types are going to be good no matter what. Even with the Fairy type in the game, they're still very good, and they're very popular and very commonly used. And the thing with Poison types and Steel types is that they were pretty poor offensively before, and they're still pretty poor offensively, even though they have another type to hit super effectively. So I feel like they probably could have balanced the Fairy type better than just, like, throwing it in there and being like, oh, we're gonna use this type to nerf these types and buff these types, because in reality, that's not really how it works, and that really gave Fairy just, like, a great start. And it's pretty good offensively, too, because it hits the same types that it resists super effectively, which are all good types to hit super effectively. Steel does resist you, which is pretty bad. And on the flip side, you have some pretty good special options as well. Like, you have... Well, let's get this out of the way. You have Geomancy, but only one Pokemon gets that, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. Moonblast is actually a pretty amazing offensive move. You're 100% accurate, you're 95%, or you're 95 base power, and then that special attack drop chance is really good. You have Moonlight as a good recovery option, even though it's a little less consistent. Overall, Fairy type is just a fundamentally strong type because of how they added it. And because, like, you see, it's a type that really the results kind of speak for themselves. You see so many Fairy types just absolutely dominate competitive, which is the same thing I can say for the next type, which is Steel type, which is my choice for the number one type in the game. The thing with Steel type is that, like I mentioned before, it's a poor offensive type, but it is by far, not even close, the single best defensive type, the single best defensive type in the game. I think if I were to make a defensive type tier list, like, Steel would probably be S tier, Fairy would probably be A tier, and those two would be, like, in a tier above everything else, and then everything else would be down here. It's just not even close. It's by far the strongest defensive presence in the game, and the thing is with ranking these Pokemon types is Here, let's look at other types. Let's look at specifically these two types that are in C tier. They're in C tier because they're very good offensive types and they're very poor defensive types. And Steel is up here because it's a pretty poor offensive type and a very good defensive type. Because the thing is, with offense, is that you're using moves. And you have the choice to use moves. You don't have the choice of what defensive type to be. Because that's an inherent property of being a type. So for example, Steel types, if you're paired with another type, you automatically have the good qualities of the Steel type, and then you can just completely fucking ignore the fact that it has any offensive traits and just use the secondary stab. And just like that, you're good. And you see this a lot, like in Pokemon, specifically competitive Pokemon, where Steel types don't run a Steel move, and because of that, they're just like fantastic. Like Pokemon like Corviknight, Pokemon like Skarmory, Pokemon like early gen Steelix, Pokemon like Steel type. Metagross is a bad example because it has Meteor Mash. What Steel types are in the game? Okay, examples, whatever. Pokemon like Heatran, where Heatran honestly barely even runs Flash Cannon. Yeah, case in point, but point is, Steel type is just amazing defensively, and for types, you would rather be a good defensive type than be a good offensive type, because you don't have to use your own moves. And on a counterpoint, Pokemon don't just get stab moves. Like, Steel types could potentially learn a fucking Ice-type move, like, right? And Ground-type moves can have all the offensive advantages of being a Rock-type without having the defensive disadvantages of having the Rock-type. And because of that, Steel is the #1 type in the game. Make sure to smash like and subscribe. Boom, like button. Make sure to subscribe because it makes me actually make videos, so you get more than one video a month. Goodbye.